So now let's take a look at our Edits button here, which we also want to be a link to our activity form. So let's head back to our app.tsx component. And one of the things that we can do since React Router 5 is pass an array of routes into our path if we want to load the same component for two different routes. And when we're creating an activity or editing an activity, we are going to be opening the activity form. So in order to do this, let's surround our create activity path in curly braces, and this is also going to need to be an array. And then I can add another element inside here, and I can add a / and say manage / and ID. And this is what we'll use to edit an activity. So I'll head over to the activity details page again. And what we'll do is we'll remove this open edit form on click event handler. And we'll say the button as equals link. And bring in the auto import from React Router DOM. So please make sure you have access to this. And we'll say as link to equals. And then we'll add curly brackets, we'll add a backticks and / and manage / then $, and then the activity.id. And if we go take a look at our browser, and let's just refresh the page, and I click on edit, we should see that we're going to the correct location. We can see the manage followed by the ID of the activity. And if I click on edit, then I get taken to the form, but clearly I'm not seeing the activity here. So we also need to load our activity just as we did in our activity details component. We need to do the same thing inside our form. So let's go to our activity form. And what we want to do is, first of all, remove the interface here because we're not using, or we can't use the activity from our parent component because we are not using a parent component anymore. We're navigating to this component via the root. So let's remove this activity from here, and we'll also remove the interface, and I'll just remove the iProps from here. And what we want to do is get our activity from our activity store, and I'll just say activity, and we'll give it the same name, the initial form states that we were using earlier, just to keep things consistent for now. And what we want to do is we want to use our root params just as we did in our activity details component so that we can go and get our activity. So I'll add an interface and we'll just call it detail params just as we did before, and we'll pass in the ID, which is a string. And then in our type parameter here, we'll use the root component props and pass in detail params, and we'll also make the, or destructure, the match from our root properties. And what we want to do next is we want to use an effect so that we can go and load our activity for this particular activity. And we've got a few things going on in here when we initialize our form. We've got our initialize form methods, and this is going to look for our activity from our store. If it finds it, it's going to return this initial form state, and if not, it's going to return an empty activity object. And then we're passing that into our use state when we initialize the form, and we set our activity inside our state and pass this down into our form. So let's see what happens if we load an activity, which means our activity inside our activity store is going to be populated. So just above the initialize form, what we'll do is we'll just use the use effect and bring this in from React as well. And what we'll do inside here is we want to load an activity. So let's bring that in as well from our activity store, or destructure it to be more accurate. And we need to be careful with use effect because remember, this runs every single time our component renders. And we only want to attempt to load an activity when we're editing an activity. We don't want to run this particular function when we're creating an activity. So what we can do is we can add a conditional here and say if the match.params.id, if that exists, then what we can do is say load activity and then pass in the match.params.id. Now with this in place, we can go and take a look and see the effects of what we've done here. And if I go and take a look and click on view an activity and click on edit, well, we can see that we get our activity here. And if I refresh the page, nothing shows up. So we're not populating our activity when we actually try and load an activity, and that's due to how we're initializing our form state. So what we're doing inside here is we're using this initialize form for our states, and because this code runs synchronously, we're not getting the opportunity to set our state with our retrieved activity because this function is running before this has had a chance to complete. So we need to make an adjustment to this particular way of initializing our form. And what we want to do, instead of using this function to initialize our form, let's add this empty activity object. So I'm just going to copy this object and use this as our initial state inside our activity here. We still want to control this particular component with local state because we're using the handle input change, and it's our local state that's being updated with our input changes. So what we want to do is, after we've loaded the activity, is call the set activity, and this will update our state with the activity that we're about to edit and render this in our component. So we can remove this initialize form function, and inside our load activity what we can do is we should have access to the len, because when we use a async await method in our activity store, and let's just go and take a look at our load activity, because we're using the async keyword here, this will automatically return a promise from this particular method. And if we hover over this method, we can see what it's returning. It's returning a promise of void. And we don't need to return our activity from here, because what we're doing is we're setting our activity in the state inside our MobX activity store. And because we're inside our form and we're using the observer higher order component, we're watching for changes inside our activity store. So when we load our activity, what we can do is say len, and in this len callback, what we can do is say set activity, and we can set this to our initial form state, which is basically our activity here from our activity store. And what we see is we're going to get a type error here because the argument of type iActivity / or undefined is not assignable to parameter of type setStateAction iActivity. So because this has got the potential to be undefined, we need to add the check to make sure that we have some initial form states before we set the activity. So just in front of this, I'm just going to say initial form states and with the double ampersand, so that we only execute the set activity if we actually have an activity in our initial form state here, and that removes the warning. So with that change in place, let's see if this has resolved our particular problem here. So I'm just going to refresh the page again, and now we can see that our activity is loading even when we refresh the page. And if I go back to activities, click on a different activity and click on edits, we can see that we've now got our second activity, and if I refresh, this is working as well. So that's okay, but we do have a few problems. And if I attempt to create an activity from here, we can see our URL is updated, but our activity hasn't, and we've still got our existing activity inside here. So we're going to need to look at a solution for dealing with this particular issue, and we'll take a look at that next.